Hello everyone. So welcome to the last week of this course, and this has been an exciting journey, I think, for some of you, as it has been for me. So now let us look at a very interesting topic, which is away from the technical discussions or techno-economic discussions which we have been doing so far. So we would look at before we wind up this course, we will look at some of the geopolitical issues, some of the finance issues, some of the business related issues, and how is that narrative impacting the whole this journey of carbon mitigation. Is that an enabler? Is that a deterrent? What kind of role is that playing? Right. So just to kind of give this lecture a summary, that in terms of why am I looking at geopolitics as the first thing. So in previous modules we have examined that how this 0 degree transition can be looked at with a lens of technology, can be looked from a sectorial transition perspective. I've talked about efficiencies, I've talked about a whole issue of carbon management, I've talked about sequestration, I've really talked about what could be a scientific way for doing this whole transition. I've also talked about challenges which technical challenges this transition might face, financial challenges this transition might face, but overall we were looking at a very positive picture, and we were looking at a picture that this is possible. If we put all our acts together, this is something which is possible. Then why is it not happening? What is the issue? Why this whole issue of carbon mitigation not being done the way it should be done? Or why is this gap widening? Why are we saying that we may have lost the battle of 1.5 degree already, and can we even save 2 degrees as one of the next path? Let us look into that more in depth. So for that, we will shift now to a more difficult dimension, the geopolitical and political economy constraint that would actually determine that how will this whole thing will actually scale. So actually it is what we will realize through this lecture is that it is not the technology which kind of constrained this deployment of net zero pathways, but it is constrained by who pays, who benefits, who decides. So it basically converts to a very classical historical genesis of the human race, is all about the power dynamics. Who is powerful? Who is controlling the whole narrative? Who is getting benefited from all of this? And because it is basically becomes a game of money versus power at the end of the day. Because remember, when we were talking about technology, we talked about so much of money which should be invested in this sector. And when the money needs to be invested in this sector, that money has to come from somewhere who has that dispensable income available with them. Okay. So while you understand that, let us just recall and recap some of the data that we have been kind of looking at multiple times. Remember, carbon is not a transitional issue, it's a stationary issue. Once carbon dioxide is in the air, it stays there for hundreds of years, 100 to 200 of years, depending upon how you are able to sequester it. So countries cannot get away by saying in terms of what are they emitting right now. So basically then if you start looking in terms of that how much countries have emitted from 1750, from wherever this kind of transition path started until today, and if you start looking from that, what you see is that US is the country who has emitted the most. China now, because of its recent emissions, is the second highest emitter, then followed by many other countries. And if you look at country like India, it has hardly contributed about 3.5% in this whole global emission so far. And while India has the highest population. And so we look into all these dimensions, that how is this, are the nations who are actually seems to have emitted the most, and which is the carbon dioxide which is hanging in our air as of now, which is leading to all this global warming. How are they kind of responding to this, and how are they looking into this whole picture? So let us look at this background slightly more. So as you can say that the whole carbon change should be understood as a multidimensional systematic problem. So wherever there are scientific constraints which we talked about, that we talked about that why science can limit it at few places, while science can be enabler at few places, but there was a whole scientific angle to this. There were economic imperatives that we also looked into, that all of this transition will require multi-trillion dollars to flow in when we want to do this change. And also there are geopolitical interest and intersects also. So all of this would play the role. So it is the transition to net zero, therefore, is not merely a technological substitution process, but it is basically restructuring the whole global development trajectory. So globe has been developing in a certain way. It has a certain financial structure to it. It has a whole financial system to it, and there is a whole power relationship, like who is whose friend, who is who's not so much of a friend. So how is that dynamics looking into it? So then so what it leads to is that leads to a kind of a fundamental tension between people who have already developed. And so we looked at one graph when we looked at that US is highest emitter if you look at from a cumulative perspective. But when you start and India sits down below at kind of a very, very low emissions from a net emission perspective so far. But if you look at the current emission rate, the picture starts to change. So China suddenly becomes the most dominant emitter because China's emission has all been in recent years. So and US can easily get away by saying that we are not emitting so much right now. So now this whole narrative starts to change when you start looking at data from one way to other way. On the other hand, India, which has not been the one of the highest emitter historically, suddenly starts looking at the third highest emitter worldwide. So then suddenly the picture starts to change, and then we start looking into that the whole tension of, in terms of that people who have developed, they have certain responsive to it, and people who are developing, they have certain needs. The whole narrative then it changes from just looking at the climate change problem in terms of the climate urgency to a development equity also. So does the nations who have not developed so far do not have right to develop themselves? Because if they develop, they will be emitting more. Remember, whenever we were talking about India's data, we were looking at very clearly that India would need to do this very huge balancing between its path of development versus developing responsibly. Now, this onus of responsible development is coming to a nation which has not emitted so far so high. So, is that fair? And that's a kind of geopolitical tensions which kind of arrives at the whole climate negotiation table. Now, so to understand this deeply, so what we need to do is that we need to make this transition from engineering feasibility to political feasibility, right? So whole narrative now changes in terms of that, from technically is it possible to politically is it possible. So that's the kind of change that we are talking about. So the central question is no longer that can we achieve net zero. The central question then becomes is that under what global condition, under what global geopolitical scenarios will countries will choose to do so. And remember, there is a whole thing that I'm not talking about here. I'm talking about the geopolitical tensions which are happening of late, like between Russia, Ukraine, US, Iran, and many other, like so North Korea also kind of threatening Japan, China threatening Taiwan. So there is a lot of interpolitics which is happening on the back of it. Are those nations even thinking the carbon footprint of each what that they are doing? So that all seems to be a meaningless kind of a discussion if you start looking from that perspective. But anyway, let's keep it out of the from a class discussion right now. So but then the narrative changes from technical narrative to a political narrative. So core analytical questions which we will try to see and try to answer would be that at what scale is emission reduction is required globally. So that is determined by climate science. So we know that the first question which is there, that how much emissions do we need to reduce, comes from climate side, particularly carbon budget derived. There is a body called IPCC who is looking into that what kind of carbon budgeting is needed. And so they do a bit of climate modeling. So on basis of some probabilistic models, we can then say that what is the probability of us crossing some certain temperatures and all those things. But we are looking at the things from a very, very scientific eyes. That's how we kind of start looking into it. Second is that how the burden of reducing this carbon should be distributed among countries or amongst geographies. How should this be distributed? Should this introduces the question of that what is equity? What is the definition of development equity versus what is the equation of financial equity? Should world be an equal place or should world be a non-equal place? So that's kind of a big development question which comes up. Historical responsibility, how much onus should be put on the historical responsibility? What is the economic capability of the nations on which the whole notion of developing responsibly is coming up? What kind of economic capability that do they cover? Do they have? Do they possess? And then so this kind of forming the whole basis of under the UNFCCC norm, the whole negotiation kind of happens around these things. When we have these COP meetings and everything, the whole negotiation then starts revolving around this thing that who is responsible, who should own what, and who should then put in how much of money or how much of efforts to reduce that carbon. Third, who finances that transition? Under what institutional arrangement? Should it be a loan-based thing? Should it be a grant-based thing? And what should be the right framework for this? And should we, because the whole thing would be that we will see through that later on in the class, is that the money which we require may not be available people who are emitting. So who are emitting right now, but the people who have emitted in the past. So shouldn't the people in the past who has emitted should take more onus of reducing this because they have emitted historically, which is the kind of carbon dioxide which is sitting in our air, or what is the greenhouse gases which is sitting in our air. and they also have the financial power also. Should the onus not be more on them than the people who are emitting more now, right, like China or India? And so for this, that brings a question of, in terms of that, how this global finance system should work. What should we have a development financial budget separately? How should this capital allocation take place? This becomes a tougher question. Who funds who? And in what, through what mechanism, being a tougher question. So basically, these three questions kind of can be summarized in certain way, that science defines the constraint. Science tells you that what can be done, what cannot be done. Politics defines the distribution, who should do it, and whose responsibility it is what politics define. And finance defines is that, is it feasible to do the changes that whatever we are targeting to do. So we cannot ignore any of these three things. So this is a very interesting kind of a triangular nexus between technology, politics and finance, and these kind of all three of them influence each one. And this becomes a very interesting narrative to kind of handle from that perspective. And this is where, when we are looking at the intersection of these three things, and we can create a right balance between these three excesses, is where we will be able to achieve the net zero aspect. While we are doing all this, so one thing which world has done, and I think I mentioned this kind of partially on the previous slide, is that there is a institutional structure or architecture which has been formed all over the world in terms of handling some of these challenges, because world thought that since there is no definitive body, remember, while we have IMF, while we have World Bank, who could basically force or arm twist some of the nations who are not behaving responsibly on certain aspects in their eyes, they can threaten them with respect to higher loan interest, or blocking the fund flow to them, or maybe the World Trade Organization can then arm twist some of these nations with respect to having the fair business practices. If some country is working on some kind of protection mechanism, or if they are trying to do some unfair business practices, there are some bodies which can then force their ways in. In case of climate, there is nothing like that. In case of climate, there are all the bodies which are there are all mostly voluntary bodies. These bodies are basically structured with a will rather than a forceful manner. So whole climate governance structure is around the internal institution. So they are not working on the basically a note where they are enforcing body, but kind of a suggestive body. And also they are not kind of a very distinct, but they are kind of playing a complementary role. The UNFCCC serves as a primarily negotiation test bed for the nations, as I already mentioned, through the negotiations which happen almost every year, which is called COP, the conferences of the parties. However, it is more of a consensus-based model, and it limits forcibility, as we have seen historically many times. These negotiations kind of falling off as soon as people walk off from the table. And the IPCC provides a scientific foundation, and including carbon budgeting and emission pathways, ensuring that there is a policy debates which are grounded in these numbers. So IPCC kind of works as a scientific body behind all this narrative, right? So and behind all this, there was a Paris Agreement which kind of created a hybrid governance model in terms of how this transition can take place between inter-countries, what is the role of finance in this thing, what is the role of financing in this. And so the Paris Agreement was historical from that perspective, that it combined global temperature target with nationally determined contributions, and it kind of tried to convert in terms of that who pays, and in terms of that what would be some kind of a mechanism in terms of that how this money transition, or how the money will become the enabler in this, and how can then money can also become the controller in this aspect also. I will talk about that more in the next lecture. So under that, the financial institutions such as Green Climate Fund or World Bank were tasked with mobilizing and channelizing climate finance through there. So though their scale remains very inadequate, as we all know that, and we will look into more of these numbers in the next class. But importantly, that there is an architecture which has been framed. The architecture has kind of three wings with respect to negotiation, science, and also financial negotiations, like again all the three aspects like what we saw in the previous slide in terms of that triangularization. That triangularization is again present there, but what it basically also has a very high limitations, which I kind of mentioned earlier, that this is not an enforcement authority. They are not enforcement bodies, these are more of suggestive bodies. And so making these climate governance fundamentally voluntary and negotiation driven, and has been one of the biggest challenges in this, that while like there is a picture in the background which is of Paris, which is supposedly one of the major breakthrough in this whole climate debate. But we all know that a lot of Paris Agreement based targets were not met later on, and we all understand that this was all due to the varied interest of various parties. While we look at the emissions from a specific eye, we start looking from a cumulative perspective, and when we start putting onus on those countries from a cumulative emissions perspective, what we also need to see is that should we also have the lens of absolute versus per capita lens? Should that be a good lens to look at it? Because what has happened is that total emissions are concentrated in few countries and few large economies. Specifically, while China is currently emitting 30% of current emissions, what we saw, and US about 14%, both India and Europe kind of contributes to 7%. So that they look to be the highest emitters worldwide from that perspective. But as soon as you start going deeper into per capita and where the responsible consumption, remember we were talking about responsible consumption as part of our earlier technical discussions. When we were talking about efficiencies, we were talking about the consumption theory around it. When we are looking to KANPUR-NPTEL and we were looking at consumption is kind of defeating the whole narrative of energy efficiency and this whole narrative of putting in the more renewable energy sources. While carbon intensity was improving, the consumption was kind of beating it down. And when we start looking into those kind of data, what we see is that the United States kind of starts emitting 14 to 15 ton of carbon dioxide per person annually, which is a huge number if you compare to something like India, where India per person kind of emits about 2 tons per capita, which is a huge difference in terms of the whole narrative kind of changes drastically with that. So this kind of highlights also that aggregated emissions may be a very limited eye to look at, because then we are not talking about responsible consumption versus irresponsible consumption. Because as soon as we start talking about responsible consumption, do few people in the name of cumulative emissions being low can continue to consume more, can continue to emit much more than the state of society which is not emitting so much because they are still lacking some of the basic amenities of life. And this kind of brings up a debate that how should this negotiation be done? Should these negotiations be done based on total emissions, or should it be done on individual emissions? Because then it will open up a new dialogue itself, that then if you start looking at the things from a per capita perspective, the whole onus of this emission will suddenly shift to countries like Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Canada, Russia, US. So there is the onus will suddenly shift rather than shifting the onus to countries like Africa, a major part of Asia, India, South America, where you will start looking at a picture where these, from a per capita perspective, since these countries are or these geographies are still waiting to be developed, they cannot emit so much because they don't have the enough resources to consume itself. Forget about overconsumption. So this kind of creates another paradox, and which is what I still not been able to resolve, where absolute emission drives climate outcome, while per capita emission will drive the whole this debate of political legitimacy around it. So that's another debate which is happening in the worldwide. So we are looking at multiple situations, right? We are looking at situation with a science-based target versus finance-based target versus political targets or geopolitical target, power-based targets. And then behind this, then there are narratives that if we start looking at that, there are bodies which are toothless bodies, which are only suggestive bodies. Then we are not looking at things in terms of a more scientific manner. When we start looking from a not scientific, but maybe scientific, we can from a cumulative perspective we can talk something else. But if you start looking at from a kind of a responsible consumption theory basis, suddenly the narrative starts to change. And then along with this, like on top of it, what has been there is a historical responsibility, and there is a whole chain of carbon equality. Because fundamentally, let me reiterate what I'm saying, that carbon is a stationary problem. Carbon is a problem where it will remain in air for 100 years or more. And now it talks about the whole issue of fairness, that it is fair to put onus on the countries who are still looking to be developed, while countries who has like India, who has only contributed fractionally despite large population, should the onus be on them, or should the onus be on countries which has historically emitted much more, like United Nations and European nations? Nearly half of the cumulative emission since 1950 has come from them. So suddenly the narrative starts to change, and then it talks about the question about fairness. What is fair? And so should the late industrialization, because of whatever geopolitics was happening in those era, I don't want to go into that in this class, should that be constrained by the limits which are actually created by early emissions from the this nation, which is so-called developed nation? Why are we talking about that a limit which is like we are limited in our carbon emissions? Is because these nations has historically kind of emitted so much, and there is so much of cumulative emissions coming from them which is sitting in air, which is leading to current situation. So this historical onus of them, should it be burden on countries like India, or should it be burden on countries like Africa or some part of Asia which is still to be developed? So should the onus come on them, or should the onus come on countries which has historically being developed and has much more financial and political responsibility and power with them currently also? Then there is another debate which will come from a carbon budget perspective. So while we all understand that about with some of the calculations, with some probabilistic theory, the emission which will be remaining for us to kind of consume or kind of emit right now to cross that 1.5 degrees, this number is debatable depending upon which calculation you are looking from. It could vary from 200 gigaton to 500, 600 gigatons. So it's all a probabilistic number. But and with the current emission of about 40 gigatons per year, this budget would typically get exhausted within a decade, implying that this emissions must decline very rapidly, or almost exponentially it should decline. So there's some mathematical equations talks about that maybe emissions have to start reducing about 7 to 8% on an annual basis for us to have any realistic chance of beating that 1.5 degrees scenario. And this is kind of unprecedented, because so far we have just slowed down our rate of emission. We have not started even reducing our emissions. And from not being able to start reducing our emissions, and with this such a fragmented power dynamics which is happening at a worldwide level, will the world will have the will or the alignment to reduce our emissions to about 7 to 8% on an annual basis? So this basically, this budget basically creates a whole situation where developed nation wants to force this narrative of carbon footprint reduction of about 7 to 8% or 10% on an annual basis, while on the other hand developing nation says, hang on, we need to still develop, and we need to give enough quality of life to our people, and for that we need to emit more. What are you talking about in terms of reducing your emissions? And now that kind of creates a situation where are we giving development space to others which have not been able to develop themselves because of the historical reasons? And so is that a fair kind of a thing that we are putting with respect to carbon budget constraints also? Is carbon budget constraint a very fair way of looking for countries which are still to be developed? Then there is a whole narrative of sectoral emission or the decarbonization complexity behind it. Remember, we talked about all this sectoral kind of a theory also, where we looked into that not all sectors kind of emit equally, can have the same mitigation path for all of them. Money required for each of these sector decarbonization will be very different. Technology interventions required for all these sectorial things will be very different. This sectorial inhomogeneity kind of creates it kind of complicates this whole global mitigation strategy, because remember, the sectors which are seemingly hard to abate, which are seemingly hard to mitigate, are the sectors which are one of the most required sectors in this whole development requirement of a nation. When nation requires those sectors to develop themselves, how can we put onus on those nations which are still to develop, that you have to work on terms of reducing emission from those specific sectors also? So it is not only a kind of a developed versus developing debate, then converts into a sectorial debate also, that which sector should we first put onus on, and which sector can actually take that burden, because the sectors which can take this burden are those the sectors which will hamper the development of these developing nations. So this sectorial inhomogeneity will imply that so uniform global policies are structurally insufficient, because while some developed nations which are still have consumed these commodities historically a lot, they don't need to consume them so much. For them, it may be fruitful, or it may be wise for them to start working on those sectors, while the nations which are still to be developed, is the right way of putting onus on them is right. So does it need that we need to have a different kind of enforcing strategy for mitigating these paths differently in different kind of areas? Is that the need? We cannot talk about the steel sector of US versus steel sector of India being looked from the same eyes. So is that the debate should we go into, and what kind of owners should both of these nations should have, given their historical context and given their current context of development versus developing process. Coming back to COP processes and geopolitical negotiation, while we know that these are kind of these are global platforms for global challenge, but however, as we have seen that these are more rule-based system, more of a political bargaining arena. So outcome has already been shaped by some nation interest, power asymmetries plays a role in this, and there are strategical negotiation behavior which kind of comes into picture. And since it's a consensus-based thing, so sometimes these powerful nations or some of the nations which has a higher voice in this whole power arena of the world has been able to get their way into blocking some of the very interesting moves. So in Copenhagen 2009, for example, a very powerful thing was getting passed where it was like 1.5 degree related target emissions were being forced as a mandatory requirement for the nations which has been should do. And from there, US and some of the nations blocked it. And they said that no, they should not be done that way, and they kind of converted that into a voluntary disclosures, which in Paris 2015 COP meeting, it was then converted into national determined emission path. NDCs were kind of defined in 2015, but it was more converted to a voluntary emission pathways, and which was linked to 2 degrees centigrade as a limiting kind of a target, not even a target, as a guideline to work on those emission pathways, rather than putting 1.5 degrees as a mandatory requirement for specifically for these developed nation. The whole onus was being put on them, and they had to fund in the requirement for the developing nations also. So developed countries sometimes tend to emphasize rapid mitigation, while developing countries prioritize equity, finance and development space. So there's a very interesting negotiation which takes year on year. So as a result, all these COP negotiations also becomes kind of a compromise rather than becoming politically climate solutions. And this has to be kind of evolved in the right way, that if this is such a burning need, should we not have a body which should be more become a governing body, and what should be the governing picture for that specific body? Should it have the similar kind of a power dynamics like many of our current bodies, like maybe UN or some other NATO or some other formations which has been faced, which has a very interesting one-sided power dynamic? Should it be a more balanced power dynamics, and where we should keep the developed versus developing nation theory in mind while we are settling on that? And then there is a whole picture of climate finance and structural balance behind this. So climate finance kind of is a critical link between ambition and implementation. So while developed nation committed of mobilizing about $100 billion annually for this kind of a mitigation, the actual fund flow has been very, very limited. So not only the fund flow from $100 billion has been pretty low, the $100 billion has not flown in. And on top of it, remember when we were talking about the number in terms how much of money do we need for this transition, where we were talking about this technical transition and everything, we were talking about a money of about $2 to $3 trillion a year, which will change to about $7 to $8 trillion a year from 2030 onwards, if you have to really see a reasonable chance of arriving at some sensible numbers in terms of this mitigations. But the money which has been committed is very meager compared to that. It's about $100 billion. And from that $100 billion also, not much is flowing to the whole problematic or needy area. So whole this composition of this finance is also very problematic, which large share is being given as loans rather than as grants. So in a way, while some of these nations are being forced to make these changes, they are given forceful loans for making these changes. So are they getting the countries which are getting in debt? So for them, this climate change is becoming a burden rather than a thing which is becoming a voluntary path for them. So this whole thing is very complicated from a financing perspective also. So then on top of it, private finance has remained concentrated in low risk market. Some of you might know that, and I think I covered that earlier in the lecture, earlier in some of the lectures where we were talking about that the more money is going into renewable energy or mitigation pathways rather than energy efficiency pathways, because that is not as obvious tool for carbon footprint reduction, and since the measurement of them becomes more difficult, so that's more risky pathway compared to the very obvious thing of putting up a solar plant or a wind plant or a storage plant. Since that becomes easier, so money has not flown into that aspect of the life, but money has flowed more into the renewable energy deployment. And so that way, the whole money which has actually been flowed, it also has flown into low risk markets, and so it also kind of works out a domain where the money also has flown into more powerful nations and not to the nation which will also need it, because they may be more risky in terms of this deployment of money. So this creates a very highly structured imbalance in terms of the money dynamics also. So while technology is one aspect to it, which is also being developed with the nations which are more technically more powerful historically also, the whole power dynamics is kind of looking very, very lopsided, very, very one-sided story. And from a finance perspective also, it is not looking a very rosy picture in terms of free flow of finance in this whole picture. And what has led to it is that it has led to a very serious situation of emission gaps. So if we try to kind of quantify the political failures, we all wants to move to 1.5 degrees centigrade scenario as a pathway. But if you look at the current things that we are going in terms of NDCs or political actions or whatever targets which has been defined, we are at best looking at a situation somewhere between ending at 2.5 degrees centigrade or 2.9 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. That's where we are kind of looking at it. In terms of some of the pledges and targets, we might be looking at 2.2 degrees centigrade also, but the money is not flowing in that direction rightly. Optimistically, even if it starts looking at things positively from now onwards also, we may start looking at 1.9 degrees centigrade situation at best. So what we are saying is that current commitments are showing about 2.4 degrees to 2.8 degrees compared to significantly over 1.5 degree target. The gap between current commitments and required emissions of almost 20 to 25 gigaton by 2030, and if you look at 2035, we will be looking at a gap of about 30 gigaton, and then another from an implementation gap perspective. From a target gap perspective, it's somewhere between 26 to 31 gigaton. And from an implementation perspective, the gap is even bigger, of over 31 gigaton to 37 gigaton. So we are not looking at a very, very rosy picture because of all the political scenarios which we talked in the earlier slide. So it is not basically the technological limitations. We have talked about technology. Technologically, things are possible, though the path may not be as simple as what we want, but politically things are possible. Problem is the weak nation commitments. Problem is insufficient finances. Problem is geopolitical conflicts. And problem is lack of reinforcement mechanism, and that is what is leading to current situation. So what we can very confidently, or maybe almost with certainty we can talk about, is that this current emission gap is fundamentally a political failure gap. It is not only a technical gap, and so it is not reflects on the failure of knowledge, but it reflects on a failure of collective action under competing national priorities. And that is very evident when you start looking at the COP negotiations, when you start looking at this inter-country kind of a dynamics. On top of it, there are emission inequalities and consumption patterns also. So if you start looking at from the population of the perspective of the world also, so the top 10% of the world emits about 76% of the emissions, and bottom 50% of the world emits only 12%, and the top 10% emits about 50%. And the money which they have is that the top 10% is about 76% of the money, and they have 76% of the money. They are emitting about 48%. So even if they start taking onus of their own responsibilities also, the world will be a much better situation. Then we start looking at the bottom of the pyramid, that they are only responsible for 12% of emission, but they hardly have any money, and still the onus is being put on them equally. Is that a fair way of looking into it? On top of it, if you start looking into it from a risk perspective, this bottom of the pyramid is where the highest risk is, because as soon as when we talk about all those climatic changes issues earlier, remember we were talking about food scarcity, we were talking about weather pattern changing, which will lead to flooding, which may lead to more water in certain areas, less water in certain areas. We were talking about situations where the resources may be constrained. People who are more powerful will continue to get those resources at a higher cost even if they need to. It is the bottom of the pyramid which will struggle with these needs. So this political situation, whatever we have talked about so far, it do not account for this big inequality being regressive. It could be political and unstable. We have talked about the social level challenges which it all can bring to. So this all can lead to a situation where the world could be a very volatile place if we don't start looking into this thing right now with a more equal and just eye. We cannot just keep on suppressing certain section of society in the need of our own benefit. So it is a very dynamic situation, or it may be a very volatile situation that we are sitting on. Then there are development versus decarbonization trade-off. We have talked about this in certain way of in earlier slides, but if you start looking at more deeper, there are pressing needs for these developing nations. For example, with some estimates, but about 700 million to about 1.2 billion people still lack electricity, primarily in developing regions. Like look at most of the Africa, where we have a huge lack of electricity. For them, emissions are not a concern, but for them, the prerequisite is development. And for them, since the prerequisite is development, this kind of creates a disbalance in the whole harmony of the world. That should we not look into development aspect of this needy people, or should we just keep on giving this leeway to the nations who has developed irresponsibly in the past, and they can get away by putting the equal onus on everybody at a worldwide level. So this trade-off would need that it is not a temporary trade-off that we are talking about. We are talking about a structural feature of the whole global economy. We are talking about particularly nations which are industrializing late. Should equal onus be put on them? And that's a debate that I would like to leave you with. So if you look at the big picture, so there are definitely policy gaps and institutional limitations which has led to current situation. So current global climate framework faces multiple structural gaps, including insufficient emission in national commitments. We are definitely seeing a gap in that, 1.5 versus 2.5 kind of a scenario in terms of commitment, inadequate financial flows, limited access to technology because technology is also limited to powerful nations, and weak governance mechanism because there is no body which is kind of driving or which can enforce these mechanisms to various geographies. These gaps are interlinked and they reinforces each other. So resulting in a system which is unable to deliver at a scale and a speed of the transformation which is required. We are sitting in a situation which is a kind of a dynamite kind of a situation, if I can, I'm using this word in lack of some different word which I can think of. So these gaps, since they are self-reinforcing, so it will lead to a system of underperformance where a weakness in one area will exemplify the other areas also, and we need to find out a way for this going forward, and so there could be some pathways to resolution. So we need to have a, just looking from a energy philosophy and practices perspective, so we need to have a more international political balance, we need to have current development crisis model in mind, and we need to have a central innovation form. So this is one aspect of looking at, there could be multiple ways in which this whole thing can be looked at. So addressing these challenges will require multi-dimensional approach, including differentiated carbon budget, scaled up climate finances. So carbon budget cannot be equal to for everyone. Developed nation versus developing nation should have a very different carbon budget, and they should have very different kind of enforcement mechanism on them. There should be a very transparent technology transfer mechanism. There should be policies to ensure that a just transition for effective communities should be there. Like we cannot just let some communities kind of wander off, and since they are again sitting at the bottom of the pyramid, we need to work out in a way that world kind of give them a equal development chances and not kind of force them to a situation where we are looking at a socially unstable world going forward. Such a approach should reconcile with climate objective with development priorities, particularly in global south. However, this will require a unprecedented coordination, and the kind of geopolitical situations that we are seeing in the world right now, I am personally not very hopeful with all this. So I'm not trying to be a negative thought process person here, but this will require a very, very huge level of change worldwide if you really have to work towards a pathway like this. So just to summarize, climate change does represent a very complex interplay of scientific constraints, economic system, geopolitical dynamics. While technical pathway for are increasingly well understood, what we saw in most of this course was that technically, policy-wise, techno-economically, things might be possible. This implementation is currently restrained by equity, finance and political will. That is the prime constraint on this whole situation right now. So arriving net zero is not a question of innovation or policy design. It is more of a question about resolving these distributional conflicts. How should we look at? Should we look at the per capita based situation, or should we look at cumulative emissions? Should we look at the historical emissions, or should we look at the current emissions? Should we look at the developed nation theory about versus having the same responsibility as the nations which are still developing and still need to feed in to half of their population? So without addressing these inequalities, the climate change target will remain a scientific necessity, and but will remain politically unattainable. Like what we'll look into next lecture is that, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? So while this is fundamentally a distributional conflict and coordination failure, can market help to resolve some of these political struggles? Can there be some ray of hope? So one of the things which tried to address this was under Paris Agreement under Article 6, where kind of a financial structure in terms of coordination was tried to be established between nations. How far that has been successful? What is the current situation of that? Can that really be an answer to this, at least from a financial angle for this situation? Or is it becoming more of a deterrent than an enabler to this climate mitigation also. Let us look more deeper in that into next lecture, that in theory, that though this Article 6 kind of create a lower global mitigation cost and increasing participation in developing nation, but however, while that is a theoretical intention of doing all this, because we were saying that we can do carbon trades, because we were saying that we can do these developing nations can use their lower development as a tool to kind of feed into the developed nation, which needs to mitigate faster. While that was a narrative through which some of these things were looked into, but have they really served the purpose that they wanted to do? And what is the current global situation which is looking around all this? And that is what we will look into next lecture. We will move from a discussion on politics in terms of some of these financial instruments. How have they evolved? What is the current situation? Are they enabler or disabler in this whole climate mitigation theory? And that is what we'll look into next class. Thank you so much.